The late afternoon sun hovered low over the New York City skyline, casting golden light that slipped between towering skyscrapers and poured onto the quiet corners of Central Park. The leaves along the paths rustled in a soft October breeze, their yellow and crimson colors painting the ground like a mosaic of forgotten seasons. The distant hum of traffic barely reached the secluded area near the lake, where the water mirrored the sky, and the world seemed to slow down for a moment. Eleanor Walsh sat motionless in her sleek custom-designed wheelchair, the maroon leather seat blending with her dark wool coat. Her silver hair, pulled back in a neat bun, framed sharp, angular features. Her blue eyes, once known for their icy confidence in boardrooms across Wall Street, stared blankly at the rippling surface of the lake. To the world, Eleanor Walsh was a legend. A pionnier. The co-founder and former CEO of Walsh Dynamics, one of the most influential tech companies in the United States. She had graced magazine covers, rubbed shoulders with presidents, and dominated conversations in Silicon Valley and the financial elite of New York. Her innovations had reshaped data security, artificial intelligence, and even medical technology. She had been celebrated not just for her brilliance but for her unapologetic stance on faith and reason. Science build the futur. God is just a bedtime story for the weak. She had uttered those words during a televised debate nearly 2 decades ago. It made headlines, sparked outrage, but also won her millions of admirers who saw her as the epitome of intellect over superstition. But now, at 76, Eleanor Walsh was not the indomitable titan the world remembered. Now she was just a fragile frame of bones and regret, confined to a wheelchair, her legs nothing more than useless appendages, silent reminders of a body and life that had betrayed her. 2 years ago, a massive stroke had paralyzed the lower half of her body. The result of stress, doctors said, and perhaps, they gently implied, years of bottling grief. Eleanor had dismissed their words, just as she dismissed anything that hinted at weakness. But grief was a beast that could not be ignored. 5 years earlier, her only child, Michael Walsh, had been killed in a horrific car accident on the FDR Drive. 29 years old. Brilliant. Kind. Far better than she ever deserved as a mother. He had been her anchor, her single connection to a world beyond profit margins and quarterly reports. His death shattered her. Eleanor didn't cry. She didn't fall apart in public. She poured millions into private hospitals, research, experimental therapies, robotic exoskeletons, anything to fix what was broken. Not just her body, but the gaping, howling emptiness inside her chest. But no technology could mend a shattered soul. And so she sat, day after day, in Central Park, watching the world move without her. Her personal nurse, Carla, had gone to fetch coffee from a nearby kiosk, leaving Eleanor alone with her silence. A silence loudé d'un any crowd. Eleanor's eyes drifted to the small plaque beside the path, a memorial bench engraved with the name of a stranger she never knew. It read, "For those we lost but never forget." The Ironistung. She had lost Michael, and despite all her power, all her money, she couldn't even forget the sound of his laughter echoing in this park when he was a boy. Millions on doctors, millions on robotics. All worthless, she muttered under her breath, her voice brittle with exhaustion and bitterness. The faint crunch of footsteps on gravel interrupted her thoughts. Turning her head slightly, Eleanor noticed a small figure approaching along the winding path. A boy. No more than 9 or 10 years old. His clothes were worn, the knees of his jeans torn, his hoodie several sizes too large and faded. His curly black hair was messy, his shoes scuffed, soles nearly falling apart. But what struck Eleanor wasn't his disheveled appearance. It was his face. His dark eyes, wide and calm, held no fear, no pity, only something Eleanor hadn't seen in years. Peace. The boy stopped a few feet in front of her, hands tucked into the front pocket of his hoodie. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the autumn breeze swirling leaves around them like silent witnesses. "May I hold your hand, ma'am?" the boy asked politely, his voice steady and strangely mature for someone so small. Eleanor narrowed her eyes, instantly suspicious. In this city, kindness often came with an ulterior motive. Was he a runaway? A street someone's pawn in a petty scam? But despite her instinctive caution, something deeper, perhaps curiosity or weariness, overrode her defenses. With a sigh, she extended her hand, expecting cold, bony fingers. Instead, the boy's hand was warm, firm, his grip steady and strangely reassuring. My name's Caleb, he said simply. And I know you can walk again. Eleanor blinked, startled. Then a sharp, incredulous laugh escaped her lips. Is that so?
Are you a neurosurgeon in disguise?
Or just another little street preacher? She retorted, her voice edged with the bitterness of 1,000 disappointments. Caleb didn't flinch. He didn't look away. I'm no doctor, he replied calmly. And I ain't trying to preach. But I know what God can do. Eleanor's jaw tightened. For decades, she had fought battles against the ignorance of blind faith. She had built empires on reason, on data, on science. She had buried loved ones, conquered illnesses, and endured personal loss, all without the crutch of religion. And yet this small boy, with nothing but calm certainty, spoke as though he carried the universe's secrets in his pocket. She pulled her hand away, irritated at her own momentary softness. Well, I believed in God too, she snapped, her voice cracking more than she intended. Until he let my husband die from cancer, until he let my son. The words caught in her throat. She hadn't spoken Michael's name out loud in months. Caleb didn't interrupt. He let the silence settle between them, heavy, unspoken, but not uncomfortable. It was a silence that didn't demand answers, only acknowledgement. Finally, he spoke, softly but firmly.
God never promised the life wouldn't hurt.
But he did promise he wouldn't leave.
Eleanor's lips trembled.
The harsh rebuttal she had prepared died in her throat. For the first time in years, she realized, maybe she wasn't as alone as she thought.
The sun dipped low behind the Manhattan skyline, Eleanor sat in silence, the boy's word lingering in the chilly autumn air. God never promised the life wouldn't hurt.
But he did promise he wouldn't leave.
The audacity. The naivety.
The simplicity of it all. And yet, it clung to her mind like the bitter aftertaste of black coffee, unwanted, yet impossible to ignore. Eleanor exhaled sharply, her hand retreating to the armrest of her wheelchair, fingers twitching slightly with frustration. The boy Caleb still stood there, as if waiting for her to say something profound or sharp, but she offered neither. Instead, she studied him. The frayed cuffs of his hoodie. The faint stains of dirt on his jeans. His untied sneakers, soles nearly worn through. Yet, despite his appearance, there was no trace of fear or desperation in his posture. "Where are your parents?" she asked flatly, masking her curiosity behind cold indifference.
Caleb shrugged.
"My mom passed last year." Her stomach tensed, though she kept her face unreadable.
And your father?
Never met him.
Eleanor beat back a bitter remark.
Of course. The city was full of abandoned, broken families.
Just another sad statistic. So you wander around harassing all women in parks?
That your idea of fun? Caleb smiled faintly, unaffected by her sharpness. No, ma'am.
Just saw you sitting here.
Figured maybe you needed a little faith.
Eleanor scoffed, the sound sharp and cutting.
Faith?
Faites burier ma husband.
Faith let cancer eat him alive while priests whispered prayers that did nothing. Faith watched my son die under a truck on FDR Drive. Her voice cracked at the last word. Despite her best efforts, a tremor rippled through her hands. Caleb's expression didn't change. He simply stepped closer, lowering himself onto the bench beside her wheelchair with the casual confidence of someone decades older. "I know about loss," he said quietly. Eleanor shot him a skeptical glance.
You're what, 9?
You think losing your mama makes you some expert on grief? Caleb didn't flinch. Maybe not. But when she passed, I sat with her. Held her hand till it went cold. He paused, staring out at the lake, his voice steady. Asked God why he let it happen. Was angry. But then I realized. He didn't take her. He called her home. The words, so simple, so unwavering, dug under Eleanor's skin like splinters. She opened her mouth to argue, to lecture him about biology, about fate, about how no amount of prayers or beliefs could rewrite the cold, brutal facts of death. But no words came. Instead, an uncomfortable quiet settled between them, broken only by the rustling leaves and distant chatter of joggers and tourists. Finally, Eleanor exhaled a bitter laugh. I've spent more money than your entire family line will ever see trying to fix what's broken. Surgeries.
Robotics. Therapy.
Her eyes narrowed. You really think your God can do what science couldn't? Caleb turned to face her, his gaze steady and calm. No, ma'am, he replied softly. I don't think he can. He paused, the faintest smile curving his lips. I know he will. Eleanor blinked, momentarily thrown off by the boy's certainty. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't naive optimism. It was something deeper. Rooted. Unshakable. She glanced away, swallowing the lump rising in her throat. Well, go on then, she muttered bitterly.
C'est your miracle prieur.
Let's see what happens. Caleb shook his head gently. Not yet. Eleanor frowned, confused. Why not? The boy's gaze drifted across the lake, following the flight of a small flock of birds as they skimmed the water's surface. Miracles don't happen when we demand them, he said simply.
They come when the heart is ready.
Eleanor stared at him, irritation flaring beneath her grief. And what makes you think my heart isn't ready? Caleb met her eyes with quiet certainty. Because you're still fighting God instead of letting him fight for you. Before Eleanor could respond, footsteps approached from behind. Carla, her caregiver, returned with 2 cups of coffee, her expression neutral but eyes briefly flicking toward the boy on the bench.
Everything all right, Mrs. Walsh?
Carla asked cautiously, handing her a cup. Eleanor hesitated, her gaze darting between Carla and Caleb. She began, but the words tangled in her throat. She turned back to Caleb, but he was already standing, dusting off his jeans. His dark eyes, calm and unwavering, lingered on hers. Same time tomorrow, he said softly, backing away down the winding path.
Eleanor scoffed.
Why would I come back? Caleb smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth lifting in quiet confidence. Because you already want to. With that he turned, his small figure blending into the drifting shadows of the trees, the late afternoon sun catching his back like a halo of fading light. Eleanor sat frozen, her coffee cooling in her hand, her mind a storm of questions and doubts. She had faced boardrooms filled with ruthless investors. She had stared down the most brilliant minds of Silicon Valley. She had outmaneuvered politicians and crushed competitors. But this small boy, with his worn clothes and simple words, had managed to shake something inside her that years of grief, loss, and bitterness could not extinguish. That night, back in her penthouse overlooking the city that once bowed to her ambition, Eleanor could not sleep. The usual distractions, the muted news channels, the endless stock reports, the sterile medical briefings, failed to quiet her mind. All she could see was Caleb's face.
Dos calmais.
The strange, infuriating certainty in his voice.
And beneatitol, the whisper of a memory Lomburier.
Michael. Her son. His laughter echoing across this very park. His tiny hand holding hers. His blue eyes filled with the same defiant faith she had always dismissed as childish. For the first time in years, Eleanor found herself whispering into the silence of her apartment. God, if you're real, if you're not finished with me.
The word faltered.
Her throat tightened. She couldn't finish the sentence. But even as the city lights glittered outside her window, her hand remained warm, as though Caleb had never let go.
And deep inside, something stirred. Inconfortable.
Unfamiliar. But alive. The next afternoon, Eleanor found herself once again by the lake in Central Park. She told herself it was for the fresh air. For the change of scenery. For anything but the boy. But the truth clung to her like a stubborn shadow, trailing her from her penthouse down to the waiting car, through the crowded streets, and along the winding paths of the park. She came because of him. Because of Caleb. Eleanor hated the admission almost as much as she hated the quiet hum of curiosity beneath her skepticism. She adjusted her scarf as Carla pushed her wheelchair along the path. They passed tourists snapping photos, joggers lost in their earbuds, dog walkers chatting casually. It was just another day in the park, yet for Eleanor, everything felt different.
Carla glanced down. Sam spot à yesterday.
Eleanor nodded stiffly. Yes. The bench near the lake was empty when they arrived.
The autumn breeze whispered through the trees, sending crimson and gold leaves tumbling to the ground like confetti at a forgotten celebration.
Carla handed her a book and a cup of coffee before stepping away to take a phone call. Eleanor sat alone, scanning the path ahead, pretending not to care, pretending not to hope. Minutes passed. The coffee cooled in her hand. The book remained unopened in her lap. Just as she considered leaving, soft footsteps approached. Eleanor's heart quickened despite herself. Caleb emerged from the curve of the path, same worn jeans, same oversized hoodie, same quiet confidence. But today, Eleanor noticed something new. Around his wrist, half hidden beneath his sleeve, was a silver bracelet. Thin, delicate, slightly tarnished. Her breath caught. It was identical to the one her son Michael had given her years ago. The one engraved with his name. The one she lost after his funeral and had searched for in vain. Caleb approached with his usual calm, settling onto the bench beside her without invitation. "You came," he said, as if it were inevitable. Eleanor's eyes remained fixed on his wrist. "Where did you get that bracelet?" Her voice was sharp, tight with suspicion. Caleb followed her gaze, lifting his arm slightly to inspect the bracelet. His expression didn't change. "Found it," he replied simply. "Found it where?" Her voice rose, brittle and accusatory. "That's not just any bracelet. It belonged to my son." Caleb's gaze softened. "I know." The audacity of his words sent a jolt of anger through Eleanor's chest. "Explain. Now." Her fingers trembled as she gestured to the bracelet. "Where did you find it?" Caleb studied her for a long moment, then reached into his hoodie pocket. His small hand emerged holding a folded piece of paper, worn and creased at the edges. "Before I answer that," he said gently, "I need you to read this."
Eleanor hésita-t-elle.
Every instinct screamed for her to dismiss him, to demand answers on her terms. But the weight of the bracelet, the familiarity, the unsettling certainty in Caleb's eyes, it all coiled around her defenses. Her hand reached out before her mind caught up, taking the paper. It unfolded with a quiet crackle, the faded ink trembling in the crisp autumn air. The handwriting was unmistakable.
Michaelis.
The note was short, uneven, written in the shaky scrawl she had teased him about as a boy. "To whoever finds this," it read.
"I don't know who you are.
"But if you're reading this, I pray you're someone still fighting.
Don't let sorrow trap your soul.
God may allow us to break, but only so He can hold us when we can't hold ourselves.
My name is Michael Walsh.
If you find this, tell my mom I'm okay."
Eleanor's vision blurred.
Her fingers clenched the paper so tightly it crumpled. Her lungs refused to fill with air. Her mind fractured beneath the tidal wave of grief and disbelief.
How? Her voice cracked.
"How did you get this?" Caleb's expression remained calm, his voice steady as ever. "Found it near a bus stop on Madison Avenue," he explained. "Tucked inside an old Bible under the bench."
Eleanor's brisiched.
She knew the spot.
Michael usait tout effort the crosstown bus there after work.
She had walked past that bench 100 times, never knowing.
Tears welled in her eyes, burning hot against the cool autumn wind.
Her hand trembled as she held the note to her chest, as if by sheer will she could pull her son back from the grave. This doesn't prove anything," she whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. "It could be fake, a coincidence." Caleb didn't argue. He didn't try to convince her. He simply sat beside her, silent, steady, letting the grief settle between them like an old friend. Eleanor's mind raced with questions, doubts, anger, and the gnawing ache of hope she thought she had buried alongside her son. For the first time, the bitterness in her chest loosened, replaced by raw, vulnerable confusion. Finally, she found her voice again. "You said yesterday, miracles come when the heart's ready," she murmured, eyes fixed on the bracelet around his wrist. "What if mine isn't?" Caleb tilted his head slightly, considering her words. "That's the funny thing about God," he replied. "He doesn't wait for perfection."
Juste honesty.
The simplicity of it grated against Eleanor's skepticism, yet beneath her defenses, it stirred something fragile and uncomfortable. She looked down at the note again, her vision swimming. Her son's words, written in desperation, yet filled with faith, a faith she had rejected, mocked, buried under logic and reason. And yet, here it was. In her hand. On this bench. Delivered by a boy who shouldn't know any of this. The ache in her chest deepened. "What if I'm angry?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "What if I've spent years blaming him?"
Calebessais mais air, un wavring, gentle.
"You think he doesn't already know?"
A terre slid daun Eleanores chic, imbiden, hot against her cold skin.
The silence returned, but this time it wasn't suffocating. It held space for grief, for doubt, for questions that had no neat answers. And beneath it all, the faintest glimmer of something she hadn't dared to feel in years. Hope. The following day, the sky over New York City was draped in pale grey clouds.
The wind carried a sharp chill, hinting at the coming winter.
Yet, Eleanor Walsh found herself once again in Central Park, seated on the same weathered bench beside the lake, waiting. She hated that she was waiting. She hated that something inside her, buried deep beneath decades of cynicism and grief, now stirred with anticipation, even if her rational mind clawed to dismiss it. Her nurse, Carla, hovered nearby, scrolling through her phone as Eleanor sat in silence, the familiar silver bracelet tucked discreetly inside her coat pocket. The note from Michael remained locked away in her purse, though it might as well have been branded onto her heart. She had barely slept the night before, tossing between disbelief and bitter fragments of hope she had sworn never to entertain again. Caleb's words echoed relentlessly in her mind. God doesn't wait for perfection.
Juste honesty.
What nonsense, she told herself. Sentimental platitudes wrapped in religious delusion. And yet, she was here. A part of her whispered that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't here by choice. At exactly 4:06 p.m., Eleanor heard the soft, familiar shuffle of worn sneakers on gravel. Caleb appeared at the bend in the path, hands tucked into the pocket of his hoodie, shoulders relaxed, eyes calm. Didn't think you'd come, he teased lightly, dropping onto the bench beside her. Eleanor exhaled through her nose. I didn't either. They sat in silence for a moment, the lake rippling gently under the wind, the distant hum of traffic filtering through the trees. Eleanor's fingers traced the edge of the bracelet hidden in her pocket. You said yesterday, she began, her voice low but steady, miracles come when the heart is ready. Caleb nodded, watching a group of ducks float across the water. What if mine never is, she asked, bitterness slipping into her tone. Caleb's lips quirked into a faint smile. It will be. Eleanor scoffed, shaking her head. You sound awfully sure for someone so young. Caleb tilted his head slightly. You sound awfully scared for someone so powerful. The remark hit her like a slap, not cruel, but jarringly honest. She let the words settle before speaking again, her voice tight. I built my entire life on reason, facts, progress. I've sat in the rooms where the future gets designed.
IVE pour de millions into research, into innovation. You think you're God quand outmatch science.
Caleb shrugged, unconcerned. I think sometimes, science and God are working the same job. Just, not always on your schedule.
Eleanor narrowed her eyes.
Spoken like someone who's never sat beside a hospital bed watching machines fail your family. Caleb's expression darkened, the calm in his eyes replaced with something heavier. I have, he admitted.
My mom. She got sick last winter.
Real bad. The doctors tried, but the machines couldn't save her. His voice cracked for the first time, revealing the raw edge of grief beneath his composure. Eleanor's posture stiffened, the familiar pang of loss tightening her chest. I was there, Caleb continued, his voice quieter now. Held her hand, till it went cold. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind rustled fallen leaves across the path. Somewhere, a child's laughter echoed faintly. Eleanor swallowed hard, the bitterness in her throat now laced with something softer.
Understanding. Shared sorrow.
I held my son's hand, she confessed, her voice a mere whisper. Or what was left of him after the accident. Her throat constricted, but the words kept pouring out, the ones she had buried for years beneath pride and pain. Michael, he was my world, she continued, her voice breaking. Bright, stubborn, too good for this place.
And then, a truck, a drunk driver gone.
Her shoulders trembled as she fought the flood of emotion, her eyes burning. I've never walked since, Eleanor admitted, her voice cracking.
Not just my leg.
Me. I've been dead for a long time. Caleb didn't interrupt. He sat beside her in quiet solidarity, letting the weight of her grief fill the space between them. Finally, he reached into his hoodie once more and pulled out something new, a folded photograph, edges worn, colors faded. Found this near that same bus stop, he explained, handing it to her. Eleanor hesitated, then unfolded the photo with trembling fingers. It was Michael. Young, beaming, standing by the very bench on Madison Avenue where the note had been discovered. Around his wrist, unmistakable, was the silver bracelet.
Briscocht, tears pooling behind her eyes. How did you?
Her voice faltered. Caleb's expression remained unreadable. Sometimes.
God leave pièce behind.
For when we're ready to see them. Eleanor pressed the photo to her chest, her entire body trembling beneath the weight of it all, grief, disbelief, longing, the gnawing ache of hope that refused to die. You think he lets all this happen? The death? The pain? For what? So we can, what? Learn a lesson. Her voice was sharp, laced with old anger. Caleb considered her question, then answered with quiet conviction. I think the world breaks us. But God. He holds the pieces. He waits. And when we're ready, he helps put us back together. Eleanor laughed bitterly through her tears.
That sounds like a fairy tale. Caleb shrugged.
Maybe. But sometimes, fairy tales come true. The ache in Eleanor's chest deepened, but alongside it bloomed something terrifying and unfamiliar, vulnerability. She hated it. She craved it. The silence returned, but now, it hummed with possibility. For the first time in years, Eleanor considered that maybe, just maybe, the war between faith and reason wasn't a war at all. Maybe they were two sides of the same fragile, aching coin. That night, the city pulsed beneath Eleanor's penthouse windows, alive with its usual symphony of sirens, honking cars, and distant laughter. But within the sterile, silent apartment that overlooked Central Park, Eleanor Walsh was anything but still. She couldn't sleep. She had tried the usual methods, television flickering in the background, news reports murmuring about the markets, her assistant's briefing papers scattered across the dining table. But the words blurred, meaningless against the storm brewing in her mind. On the coffee table, under the dim glow of the reading lamp, sat the photograph Caleb had given her.
Michael.
Her son. Frozen in time, smiling by the old bus stop on Madison Avenue, his wrist adorned with the silver bracelet she thought lost forever. Eleanor traced her fingers over the image for what felt like the 100th time, her chest tightening with grief, disbelief, and something dangerously close to longing. Her hand slipped into her coat pocket, retrieving the bracelet. It was unmistakable. Worn, the tiny engraving still clear.
Michael.
She had commissioned the bracelet herself when Michael was 15, a small symbolic gift after he'd aced his science fair project. He had worn it religiously, even when he grew older, even after their relationship became strained in the final years. After the accident, it vanished. No one could explain where it went. The hospital had claimed it wasn't among his personal effects. Eleanor had raged, threatened lawsuits, accused staff of theft. But the bracelet was gone. Another bitter piece of her son lost to the chaos of grief. Until now. Caleb's voice echoed in her mind. Sometimes.
God leave pièce behind.
For when we're ready to see them. The rational part of her mind screamed that it was coincidence. Probability.
A strange, cruel twist of fate.
But the bracelet's weight in her palm, the photograph, the note. It gnawed at her skepticism. Eleanor rose from the couch, the hum of her motorized wheelchair the only sound in the apartment. She moved to the large window overlooking the park, the city sprawling endlessly beyond. Her reflection stared back, tired eyes, silver hair, fine lines etched deep from years of stress and sorrow. You're losing it, she muttered to herself. But even as the words left her lips, she reached for her phone. A quick search brought up the old police report, the exact location of the accident that had taken Michael's life. FDR Drive, near the 72nd Street exit.
A straight shot from Madison Avenue.
Bus stop to accident site.
Eleanor's Pulse Weekend.
Why had she never connected those locations? Why had she never considered that her son had been near that bus stop, that maybe, just maybe, he left that note intentionally? Her mind rebelled.
Impossible. Absurde.
And yet, Caleb had found it. Years later. Intact. A fragment of Michael.
A message from beyond the grave.
Her heart clenched, and for the first time in years, Eleanor whispered a name she had avoided for so long.
Michael. The sound cracked in the empty apartment.
Tears prickled at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away, forcing herself to breathe evenly. This was weakness. Emotion clouded judgment. And yet, the ache in her chest refused to be silenced. She thought of Caleb, the quiet certainty in his voice, the weight of shared grief behind his young eyes. He had lost his mother. He understood pain. And somehow, impossibly, he carried the missing pieces of her shattered world. Eleanor tightened her grip on the bracelet. Enough. Tomorrow, she would confront him. Demand answers. Demand the truth, no matter how fantastical or infuriating it might be. She wasn't ready to surrender to faith, but she was ready to fight for understanding. The next morning arrived, overcast and cold. Carla offered to cancel their usual park visit, citing the chilly weather, but Eleanor refused. Wrapped in a heavy coat and scarf, the silver bracelet hidden beneath her sleeve, she returned to Central Park. The bench by the lake awaited. So did Caleb. He approached from the winding path, as if he had been waiting for her all along. You came, he remarked, settling beside her.
Eleanor wasted no time. Tell me the truth, she demanded, holding up the bracelet.
Where did you really get this? How do you know about my son? Caleb's eyes didn't waver.
He told you.
Found the bracelet. Found the note. Same place. Convenient, Eleanor retorted sharply. And the photograph? You expect me to believe you just stumbled across that too? Caleb's lips twitched into a faint, knowing smile. Belief's not really your strong suit, is it? Eleanor's glare could have melted steel.
I'm serious, Caleb.
So am I. The boy's expression softened, the teasing gone. I can't explain everything, he admitted. But I know this, sometimes we find exactly what we need, when we finally stop running from it. Eleanor's grip on the bracelet tightened, the cold metal biting into her palm. Her skepticism burned, but alongside it was something worse, uncertainty. Why me? She whispered, the fight draining from her voice. Why now? Why bring me this hope, after all these years? Caleb tilted his head, considering her question. Because your heart's been locked up, he said simply. And maybe, just maybe, it's finally ready to open. Eleanor scoffed, though the sound lacked conviction. You think this bracelet, note, they're supposed to fix me?
Make me believe again. Caleb shrugged.
Not my job to fix you. Just, to remind you, you're not as alone as you think. The words sliced through her defenses. For the first time, Eleanor couldn't summon a biting retort. She stared at the bracelet, at the faint engraving of Michael's name, and the photograph in her coat pocket. The war between reason and faith raged silently within her. But the first cracks in the wall she had built around her heart had begun to form. The following afternoon, Eleanor arrived at Central Park early. The sky was heavy with clouds, thick and gray like old wool, pressing down on the city. The crisp wind stung her cheeks as she waited on the familiar bench near the lake. The bracelet lay cool against her wrist beneath her coat sleeve, hidden but ever present. She told herself she wasn't here for Caleb. But the lie was thin and brittle, ready to shatter. Each passing minute tightened the knot of anticipation in her chest. She didn't understand this boy. His calm. His unsettling knowledge. His impossible connection to Michael. But what terrified her more was not understanding herself anymore, the cracks forming in her long-cultivated walls of reason and logic. By the time the small figure emerged from the bend in the path, Eleanor's fingers were trembling on the wheelchair's armrests. Caleb approached, his hoodie pulled tighter against the wind, the worn edges of his jeans flapping slightly. But his eyes were steady, unwavering as always. You're early, he observed, settling beside her. Eleanor's jaw clenched. I have questions. I know, Caleb replied softly. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence filled only by the rustling leaves and the distant hum of the city beyond the park. Finally, Eleanor found her voice. You said, the world breaks us. That God holds the pieces, she began, her tone sharper than intended. But what if he's the one doing the breaking? Caleb's expression didn't change. You blame him.
Eleanor exhalait harshly, bitterloter escaping her lips.
Blame? I despise him. If he even exists, he's cruel. Sadistic.
The word hung in the air like poison.
I built my life on reason, Caleb, she continued, her voice rising with frustration. I believed in science, in progress, in control. But nothing prepared me for watching my husband waste away, for seeing my son's body broken on a street corner. Her throat tightened, her eyes burning. I've been in this chair for 2 years, she whispered, rage and grief tangling in her voice.
My body, my life, all shattered. And you want me to believe some divine plan is at work.
Caleb listened, patient as ever, letting her fury bleed into the open space between them. When she finally fell silent, breathing hard, eyes glistening with unshed tears, he spoke. God didn't promise the pain wouldn't come, he said quietly. But he promised you wouldn't face it alone. Eleanor's laugh was brittle, broken. I've been alone every day since Michael died. Caleb shook his head gently.
You've been angry.
You've been hurting. But you've never been alone. Eleanor turned toward him, her eyes hard, brimming with years of buried pain. Where was he when the truck hit my son? She snapped. Where was he when they called me from the hospital? When I saw Michael's body, when I couldn't breathe, when I stopped living? Caleb didn't flinch at her venom. He was there, he said softly.
Beside you. Holding you.
You just couldn't feel it through the anger. Eleanor's throat closed, her hands curling into fists on the wheelchair's arms. You expect me to believe that? She choked out. That the God I've mocked, the God I've cursed, was beside me? Caleb's gaze never wavered. I know he was.
Eleanor's composure craqued, the dam of grief and fury breaking open.
Hot tears spilled down her cheeks as her body trembled. I can't, her voice fractured.
I can't believe after everything.
Caleb placed his small hand gently over hers, warm and steady. You don't have to believe everything, he whispered. Just believe he never stopped loving you.
Eleanor's brisiched.
The warmth of his hand was startling, grounding. For the first time in years, the tightly coiled storm of anger and sorrow inside her began to unravel, thread by thread. I spent my whole life building walls, she admitted, her voice barely audible. Walls of success, of science, of pride. But they couldn't save me. They couldn't bring him back. Caleb nodded.
Walls keep pain out.
But they keep love out too. The truth of it pierced deeper than she cared to admit. They sat in silence for a long while, the cold wind brushing past, the lake rippling under a pale, overcast sky. Finally, Eleanor whispered, I don't know how to let go. Caleb smiled gently. That's okay. You've already started.
Eleanor's lips trembled.
The terrifying realization washed over her like cold rain. For the first time in years, she wasn't clinging to the anger. She wasn't clutching the grief like armor. She was opening, cracking,
breaking apart, yes.
But maybe, being broken wasn't the end. Maybe it was the beginning. Caleb, she asked, her voice fragile but sincere. Why me? Why now? The boy considered her for a moment, then glanced toward the sky, the heavy clouds pressing low. Sometimes, he said softly, we don't get to pick the timing. But he does. Eleanor followed his gaze, her heart pounding beneath ribs that had known nothing but sorrow for so long. She wanted to protest, to retreat into the safety of logic and doubt. But the bracelet on her wrist, the note in her pocket, the warmth of the small hand over hers, all of it whispered a different truth.
A dangereux, un familiar truth.
Hope. Eleanor couldn't sleep that night. Even after leaving the park, even after Carla pushed her through the pristine glass doors of her penthouse and into the silence of her apartment, her mind would not rest. The city outside glowed with life, flashing headlights, distant sirens, muffled voices drifting upward from the street, but within these walls, there was only the quiet hum of memory and doubt. The bracelet weighed heavily on her wrist. The photograph of Michael, worn and creased, sat on her coffee table. And in her purse, the folded, faded note Caleb had given her, the impossible message written in her son's unmistakable handwriting, cold to her like a whisper from another life. She poured herself a glass of scotch, ignoring Carla's disapproving glance as the nurse retired for the night. The burn of the liquor did little to soothe her nerves. It wasn't just grief haunting her now. It was uncertainty. For decades, Eleanor had thrived on control, on knowing, on building her world with logic, science, and unwavering reason. But Caleb had cracked something open. His words, his impossible knowledge, the way he carried fragments of Michael, the bracelet, the note, the photograph, all of it gnawed at her skepticism. And beneath the stubborn disbelief stirred something far more dangerous. Hope. The kind of hope that could dismantle her carefully constructed world. She picked up the note again, running her thumb across the faded ink.
Don't let sorrow trap your soul.
God may allow us to break, but only so He can hold us when we can't hold ourselves. Her throat tightened. She had spent years trapped, physically, emotionally, spiritually.
Emprisonnée of grief. Of rage.
Of doubt. But now, the cracks in the walls were widening. And she wasn't sure if she should patch them up, or finally let them crumble. The next afternoon, Eleanor returned to Central Park. The sky was clearer, streaked with soft orange and pink hues as the sun dipped toward the horizon. The crisp breeze whispered through the trees, sending golden leaves tumbling to the ground. She sat on the familiar bench by the lake, the note clutched in her lap. She didn't have to wait long. Caleb appeared, as steady and quiet as always, his hoodie pulled up against the wind, hands tucked into his pockets. You look tired, he remarked gently, settling beside her.
Eleanor exhalait d'un humorless log.
I haven't slept in days. Too much thinking, Caleb observed. Too much, everything, she admitted, holding up the note. This has been all I can think about. Caleb's gaze drifted to the paper in her hands, then back to her eyes.
You read it.
Over and over, Eleanor whispered, her voice raw. His handwriting, his words. It doesn't make sense. Caleb didn't argue. He never did. I've spent years, Eleanor continued, believing there's nothing beyond what we can see, measure, explain. But now. She trailed off, the confession unfinished but heavy in the air. Caleb nodded, patient. Eleanor swallowed hard. I want to believe that this is real. That he, Michael, is okay. But part of me is still angry.
Still broken.
Caleb's expression softened. It's okay to be broken, he said. It's okay to be angry.
Eleanor shook her head. You make it sound so simple.
It's not, Caleb admitted. But it starts with honesty. You've already started. A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the rustling leaves and distant voices. Finally, Eleanor turned toward him, her voice quieter but steadier. I need to know, why now? Why after all these years? Why are you the one bringing me this impossible hope? Caleb's gaze didn't waver. Because your heart wasn't ready before, he said simply.
It's ready now.
Eleanor wanted to argue, to retreat behind the familiar fortress of logic. But she couldn't deny the truth blooming painfully in her chest. The fortress was already falling. The walls she had built from grief and reason, from pride and fear, they were crumbling stone by stone. And in their place, fragile, terrifying hope was taking root. Caleb reached into his hoodie pocket again, pulling out something new, a small weathered Bible, the edges frayed, the leather cracked with age.
Eleanor's briscote. Michael's Bible.
She recognized it instantly, the worn cover, the faint initials on the inside flap. He had carried it everywhere, a quiet rebellion against her scorn for faith. After the accident, it had disappeared, along with the bracelet and countless pieces of him she had lost. How? Her voice faltered as Caleb placed the Bible gently in her lap. Found it with the note, he explained softly.
Some place.
Eleanor's fingers trembled as she opened the Bible, her eyes scanning the familiar handwriting, the underlined verses, the small doodles in the margins. Memories flooded her, the sound of Michael reading quietly in his room, the arguments they'd had over faith, her bitter dismissal of his beliefs. Regret sliced through her. I pushed him away, she whispered, tears filling her eyes. I mocked him. I couldn't understand. Caleb's hand rested lightly on hers. He understood, the boy said gently. He never stopped loving you.
Eleanor's brisiched, her tears spilling freely now.
The fortress of logic, of pride, of fear, collapsed entirely. And all that remained was raw, unfiltered grief, and the fragile, trembling possibility of redemption. They sat in silence as the sun dipped lower, casting golden light across the water. Eleanor clutched the Bible to her chest, her heart pounding beneath ribs that had only known sorrow for so long. She wasn't ready to surrender completely. But for the first time, she wasn't running. She wasn't fighting. She was opening. breaking, healing. And though the road ahead was uncertain, terrifying even, a small impossible truth bloomed within her. Hope had found a way in. The late October sun hovered low over Central Park, casting streaks of amber and gold across the water's surface. The air had grown colder, crisp with the quiet warning of approaching winter, yet Eleanor barely noticed the chill. Her hands trembled as they rested atop the worn leather cover of Michael's Bible, the weight of it grounding and unsettling all at once. For years, she had scoffed at this book. For years, it had been a symbol of division between her and her son, a constant reminder of the chasm between faith and reason. But now, with the Bible resting in her lap, the faded note folded beside it, and the bracelet cool against her wrist, Eleanor felt her carefully constructed certainty unravel. Caleb sat quietly beside her, as steady as ever. They had exchanged few words in the last hour. They didn't need to. The silence held space for grief, for reflection, for the terrifying possibility of hope. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, her thoughts tangled. She remembered the countless nights spent in sterile hospital rooms, watching monitors beep, watching scientists debate treatment plans, watching machines fail to save the ones she loved. Science had given her success. Science had built her empire. But it hadn't saved Michael. And now, sitting in a public park, with a boy she barely knew holding pieces of her shattered past, she couldn't ignore the shift happening within her. A tremor rippled through her leg. Subtle. Barely noticeable. But enough to steal her breath. Her eyes snapped open. She stared down at her lap, uncertain.
Again, the fainteste sensation.
A twitch beneath the heavy blanket of numbness that had engulfed her lower body for 2 years. Her heart stuttered in her chest. Caleb noticed immediately, his gaze sharpening. "You felt that, didn't you?" he asked gently. Eleanor swallowed hard.
I don't know.
But she did. It had been faint, unexpected, but real. The logical part of her mind fought to dismiss it, nerves misfiring, phantom sensations, a cruel trick of the body. But deep down, beneath the years of skepticism, a different possibility whispered.
Caleb essaye, elle te nos moqueries, only qui est certain-ti.
"It's starting," he said simply. Eleanor's throat tightened. "What's starting?" "The miracle," he replied. A bitter laugh escaped her, sharp but weaker than usual. "Don't do that," she warned, though her voice trembled.
Don't feel my head with, impossible.
Caleb didn't argue. He didn't push. He just waited. And the sensation returned.
Stronger this time.
A gentle pulse beneath her thigh, a faint tingle crawling down to her knee. Eleanor's hands shot to the wheelchair's armrests, gripping them so tightly her knuckles whitened. "I felt that," she whispered, panic and disbelief colliding. Caleb nodded, his expression calm. "I know." Eleanor's pulse thundered in her ears. For months, doctors had told her recovery was improbable, nearly impossible. The paralysis was severe. No amount of therapy, no technology, no medical advancement had restored feeling to her legs.
And now, in a public park, without wear, without medicine, without reason.
It was happening.
Panique gripped her.
"This isn't real. It can't be." "It is," Caleb insisted softly.
"You're ready." Tears pricked at Eleanor's eyes, a firwared with fragile hope.
"I'm not ready," she confessed, her voice cracking. "I don't."
I can't believe.
"You don't have to believe in the miracle yet," Caleb replied. "You just have to believe he never left you."
Eleanor's brisiched.
The warmth of the boy's words settled into her chest, unfamiliar yet strangely comforting. More movement. This time undeniable. A twitch of muscle along her right thigh. Then, faint pressure along her calves. The impossible reality of it threatened to unravel her entirely. A small group of college students passed nearby, laughing, sipping coffee, oblivious to the quiet, extraordinary moment unfolding on the weathered bench.
Eleanor's mind raced.
This couldn't be happening. And yet, it was. She could feel it. The war between logic and faith reached a crescendo within her. Panic clawed at her chest, but beneath it, rising steady and unrelenting, was something else. Hope.
Real.
Terrifying. Liberating. Caleb's hand rested lightly on hers. "It's okay to be scared," he whispered. "But you're not alone." Eleanor's tears finally fell, hot streaks down her chilled cheeks. For years, she had carried grief like armor. For years, she had buried her faith beneath the rubble of science and loss. But now, in this moment, with impossible sensations sparking life into her broken body, the walls fell completely. She wasn't ready to believe in God. But she couldn't deny what was happening. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. A soft click of a camera phone interrupted her thoughts. The group of students had paused nearby, one of them holding up their phone, recording casually. Eleanor's heart lurched, self-consciousness flaring. She shifted in the chair. Her foot moved. The students gasped. The girl holding the phone whispered to her friend, eyes wide with disbelief. Eleanor looked down. Her foot had moved.
Not imagined.
Not phantom.
Réal.
Her breath caught a sensation bloomed down both legs, pins and needles, weak but present.
The world tilted. Can I pray with you now?
Caleb asked softly. Eleanor turned toward him, raw vulnerability etched across her features. For once, she didn't argue. She nodded.
Qu'elle baisse molle en clasped-terre, warm and steady.
His prayer was quiet, simple, words of surrender, words of gratitude, words of healing. When Eleanor opened her eyes, the world looked different. Brighter. Sharper. The air buzzed with possibility. And for the first time in years, Eleanor Walsh stood. It was unsteady, shaky, muscles trembling from disuse. But she stood. The students gasped audibly. One stumbled to retrieve her dropped phone. Eleanor's vision blurred with tears as her trembling legs bore her weight. She turned toward Caleb, breathless, overwhelmed. But the boy was gone. No goodbye. No explanation. Just the lingering warmth of his hand on hers, and the impossible truth blooming within her chest. She had stood.
The miracle had begun.
It didn't take long for the video to explode online. By the time Eleanor returned to her penthouse that evening, her legs weak but carrying her with halting miraculous steps, the footage had already made its way onto social media. The college students had posted it to their Instagram and TikTok accounts within hours. It showed Eleanor Walsh, the Eleanor Walsh, billionaire tech mogul, known for her icy pragmatism and infamous disdain for faith, standing from her wheelchair in Central Park. The shaky camera captured her faltering first steps, the stunned gasps of onlookers, the tears rolling down her face. What it didn't capture, what no one could explain, was Caleb. He wasn't in the video. Not a glimpse of him beside her. Only Eleanor, standing alone, as if pulled upright by some unseen force. By morning, the footage had gone viral. News outlets scrambled for the story. Miracle in Central Park, the headlines blared.
Billionaire Eleanor Walsh walks again. Medical breakthrough hors divine intervention.
Eleanor's phone rang incessantly. Journalists camped outside her building. Talk shows dissected the video frame by frame. Some called it a medical marvel, speculating about hidden therapies, secret treatments, or cutting-edge technology. Others weren't so convinced. She stood from that chair like it was nothing, one commentator argued. 2 years paralyzed, and suddenly she walks? That's not medicine. That's a miracle. Conspiracy theories sprouted like weeds. Some believed Eleanor had staged the event, a calculated PR move designed to distract from declining stock prices or boardroom drama. Others claimed it was the result of experimental stem cell research funded in secret by her company. Religious leaders seized the moment. Clips of pastors and priests declaring it divine proof played on repeat across networks. Eleanor watched it all from her penthouse, the silver bracelet cool against her wrist, the worn Bible and faded note resting on her coffee table. Carla hovered nearby, her expression unreadable. You should issue a statement, Carla advised cautiously. Before the rumors get worse. Eleanor sipped her tea, her gaze distant. What would I say? She murmured. The truth, Carla replied. Or at least, your version of it. But Eleanor wasn't ready. The world demanded explanations. But she barely understood it herself. The sensation in her legs was returning slowly, unevenly, like forgotten muscles waking from a deep, stubborn sleep. She could walk, haltingly, shakily, but it was real. And Caleb was gone. She had searched the park the next day. No sign of him. No one had seen him. No one knew him.
No name.
No parents. No trace. The only proof he existed was the bracelet, the Bible, the note, and the impossible hope blooming in her chest.
The media frenzy intensified.
News vans lined the street outside her building. Her company's stock fluctuated wildly. Requests poured in from talk shows, medical journals, faith-based podcasts, documentary producers.
Everyone wanted a piece of the miracle.
Eleanor stayed silent. She wasn't ready to speak. Not until she understood. Not until she saw him again. And so, every afternoon, Eleanor returned to Central Park. Same bench. Same time.
Day after day.
Hoping. Waiting. But Caleb never came. She walked now slow measured steps along the familiar path, each one a defiant act against doubt and fear. Her heart remained heavy with questions. But alongside them bloomed something she couldn't deny. Faith. Not polished, not perfect, but fragile.
Real.
On the 12th day after her first steps, a journalist cornered her near the park's exit. The woman, young, ambitious, microphone in hand, shoved forward, camera crew trailing behind. Mrs. Walsh, she called, breathless with excitement. The world wants to know, how did you do it?
The recovery, the walking.
Was it medicine? Faith?
A publicity stunt.
Eleanor paused, her body trembling, not from weakness, but from the enormity of the moment.
The reporter presse donc.
Millions of people are watching, she urged. What do you say to them? Eleanor considered the cameras, the prying eyes, the world's insatiable curiosity. She thought of Caleb, the boy with quiet eyes and impossible knowledge. She thought of Michael, the son she had lost, and yet somehow, never truly lost. Finally, Eleanor met the reporter's gaze. I don't have all the answers, she admitted, her voice steady. I don't know how or why. But I know this, sometimes, the impossible happens. The reporter leaned in. Are you saying it was a miracle? Eleanor's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. I'm saying. I stopped running from what I couldn't explain. The camera light glared in her eyes, but she stood tall. The interview aired that evening. The clips circulated worldwide. Debate erupted. Scientists dissected her words. Religious leaders claimed victory. Skeptics rolled their eyes. The world argued, speculated, obsessed. And Eleanor returned to the park. Every day. Same bench. Same time. Waiting. Hoping. Believing. The boy never returned. But his absence no longer filled her with despair. He had already given her what she needed. Not just her legs. Not just the bracelet, the Bible, the note. But the most dangerous, most precious thing of all. Hope. 3 months passed.
Winter crept over New York City, blanketing the skyline in grey and white.
Snow dusted the sidewalks, clung to the bare branches of Central Park, and curled against the lake's frozen edges. But every day, Eleanor Walsh returned to the same bench by the lake. No wheelchair.
Non heure hovering behind her.
Just her own 2 feet, unsteady but determined, carrying her across the park with slow measured steps. The first few weeks, the media followed her. Paparazzi camped near the park entrances. Curious onlookers whispered as she passed, their gazes lingering on her legs, their phones raised discreetly. But eventually, the frenzy died down. The world moved on, hungry for the next sensational story. And Eleanor remained. Same bench. Same time. Every day. Waiting. Not for the cameras. Not for the journalists. For him. But Caleb never returned. She searched for him, asked around the park, showed his photograph to vendors, spoke with community groups, even filed a missing person report. No one had seen him. No one knew him. It was as if the boy had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only fragments of himself. The bracelet, the Bible, the note, the impossible hope that had slowly stitched Eleanor's broken world back together. She still wore the bracelet every day. Michael's name pressed against her wrist, a silent reminder. The Bible sat on her nightstand, its worn pages marked with underlined verses and quiet, handwritten notes from her son. And the note, that impossible note, was framed in her living room, resting beside a photograph of Michael as a child. She didn't need the world to believe. She didn't need science to explain. The proof was in her steps. In her breath. In the quiet ache that had softened, replaced by fragile peace. Winter deepened.
The lake froze solid.
The trees stood bare, skeletal against the grey sky. But Eleanor never missed a day. And every afternoon, she left something behind on the bench.
A sandwich. Always the same.
Wrapped neatly in wax paper.
Peanut butter and jelly, Michael's favorite à boy.
It wasn't much. But it was a gesture. An offering. A quiet, persistent hope that maybe, one day, Caleb would return. Sometimes, the sandwich was still there when she left. Other times, it was gone. She never knew who took it. Perhaps a homeless man. Perhaps a curious child. Perhaps, him. She didn't ask. She didn't need to know. It was enough to keep showing up. To keep believing. The hardest part, she had realized, wasn't walking again. It wasn't answering the media or enduring the world's endless speculation. It was learning to live with the questions. The ones without answers. The ones that science couldn't solve. The ones that only faith, raw, uncertain, imperfect faith, could sit beside without judgment. Eleanor still struggled with doubt. She still wrestled with the sharp edges of grief. But she was no longer trapped. She no longer carried her anger like a shield. She had laid it down. Here, on this bench. With a boy who had appeared, impossible and unexplainable, when she needed him most. And whether Caleb had been real or not, it didn't matter anymore. The miracle wasn't just in her legs. It was in her heart. In her willingness to open. To break. To hope. The world continued to argue. Doctors speculated.
Skeptics looked.
Believers proclaimed. But Eleanor no longer cared for the noise. The only truth that mattered was her own. She walked. She grieved. She believed. And every afternoon, as snow blanketed the ground and her breath curled in clouds before her, she sat on the bench by the lake. Alone. But never lonely. Waiting. Hoping. And sometimes, when the wind shifted and the snowflakes danced, she could almost hear the echo of a familiar voice beside her.
Sometime tomorrow.
Her lips curved into a faint smile. Yes, she whispered to the empty space.
Sometime tomorrow.